You are sitting in your car after a conversation that should have lasted 5 minutes but somehow stayed with you for the rest of the night. Someone asked a question that seemed almost too simple to matter. If the Bible really teaches hell the way most people imagine it, why do so many passages seem to describe it differently? You wanted to answer immediately because the picture in your mind felt obvious. Endless fire, endless punishment, endless suffering. You had heard it since childhood. You had seen paintings, movies, sermons, and conversations that all pointed toward the same image. Yet the more you tried to explain why you believed it, the more you realized you were relying on memories instead of the text itself. That moment is more familiar than most people admit. Human beings naturally inherit beliefs before they investigate them. We trust our families because that is how children survive. We trust communities because belonging feels safer than isolation. We trust traditions because they have already answered questions we have not even learned to ask. None of that makes those traditions false. It also does not automatically make them true. It simply explains why changing our minds feels so emotionally expensive. We rarely question ideas that helped shape our identity because questioning them feels like questioning ourselves. That psychological reality reaches far beyond religion. It shapes politics, culture, morality, family traditions, and even the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Hell is one of those subjects where emotion often arrives before evidence. Fear arrives before curiosity. Certainty arrives before investigation. The irony is that the Bible itself contains a collection of books written across many centuries, in different languages, for different audiences, during different historical moments. Expecting every passage to fit neatly into a single modern image can become more complicated than many people realize. One of the first surprises encountered by readers who begin examining the text closely is that the English word hell often translates several different original terms. In the Hebrew scriptures, one frequently encounters Sheol, a word that many scholars understand as referring to the realm of the dead, rather than a place explicitly described as eternal fiery punishment. Sheol appears as the common destination of humanity, the place where both the righteous and the wicked are said to go after death in numerous passages. It is described with mystery, silence, darkness, and separation from ordinary life, but the imagery is not identical to the detailed pictures that later became familiar in much of popular Christian imagination. By the time readers reach the New Testament, another word appears repeatedly: Gehenna. That name referred to an actual valley associated with Jerusalem, carrying historical associations that made it a powerful symbol in the teachings attributed to Jesus. Scholars differ over exactly how those references should be understood. Some see Gehenna primarily as a vivid warning of divine judgment. Others understand it as symbolic language rooted in prophetic imagery. Others argue that it points toward final destruction rather than endless conscious suffering. Still others maintain that it clearly teaches eternal punishment. The debate itself reveals something important. Serious readers who share deep respect for Scripture have not always reached identical conclusions. Recognizing that diversity does not settle the question. It simply reminds us that history is often more complex than inherited assumptions. Another Greek term appearing in some translations is Hades, commonly connected with the realm of the dead, while Tartarus appears only briefly in a specific context. Modern readers often encounter all of these translated simply as hell, even though each carries different historical and literary associations. Translation always involves interpretation. Words rarely move from one language into another without losing some of their original range of meaning. That is not evidence of deception. It is simply one of the unavoidable challenges of translating ancient literature into modern languages. This is where psychology quietly enters the conversation again. Once we have formed a mental picture, every verse tends to reinforce it. We notice passages that support our expectations while unconsciously minimizing those that complicate them. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. It affects scientists, judges, historians, believers, skeptics, and everyone else. The goal is not to pretend we can eliminate bias completely. The goal is to become aware that it exists. Awareness creates room for intellectual humility. Consider how differently two sincere readers can approach exactly the same passage. One begins convinced that eternal conscious punishment has always been the central biblical teaching. Every difficult verse becomes additional confirmation. Another begins persuaded that final destruction rather than eternal torment better fits the overall narrative. The same verses now appear to reinforce that framework instead. A third reader sees biblical judgment, ultimately leading toward restoration, emphasizing passages that speak of reconciliation and renewal. None of these readers necessarily lacks intelligence. Often they begin with different assumptions inherited through different communities. Communities are remarkably powerful. Human beings rarely believe in isolation. We absorb confidence from people we trust. If everyone around us describes something as obvious, it eventually feels obvious whether or not we have personally examined the evidence. That is not unique to religion. Entire cultures have confidently defended ideas later abandoned. Entire generations have accepted conclusions that future generations questioned. This should not make us cynical. It should make us careful. Confidence and popularity are not reliable measurements of truth. Neither is personal sincerity. Someone can honestly believe something and still be mistaken. History demonstrates that reality does not adjust itself to our certainty. Another layer appears when examining how later history influenced the modern imagination. Medieval literature, sacred art, preaching traditions, and cultural storytelling contributed enormously to the images many people carry today. Some of the most vivid pictures of hell familiar in Western culture owe as much to artistic imagination and theological reflection as they do to direct biblical description. That observation is not an attack on those traditions. Traditions often help communities communicate profound moral and spiritual ideas. The question is simply whether cultural imagery and biblical language should always be treated as identical. Sometimes they overlap significantly. Sometimes they do not. Many people discover that the image living inside their imagination comes from centuries of accumulated interpretation rather than from reading biblical passages consecutively on their own. That realization can feel unsettling because inherited familiarity often masquerades as textual certainty. Imagine two neighbors who both grew up hearing exactly the same sermons. One never revisits the subject and assumes nothing remains to explore. The other begins reading ancient historical context, comparing translations, studying literary genres, and listening respectfully to scholars representing different theological traditions. The second person does not necessarily abandon belief. In many cases, they emerge with deeper faith precisely because they now understand why disagreements exist. Their confidence becomes less dependent on repetition and more dependent on careful investigation. That difference matters because mature conviction usually survives difficult questions better than inherited certainty does. There is another psychological dimension that deserves attention. Fear can motivate genuine moral reflection, but it can also discourage honest inquiry. If asking questions feels dangerous, people eventually stop asking them. Curiosity retreats. Silence replaces investigation. Yet throughout history, thoughtful believers have argued that truth has nothing to fear from sincere examination. If an idea is true, honest investigation should clarify it rather than destroy it. If investigation reveals greater complexity than expected, perhaps complexity was present all along. That possibility should not automatically produce panic. Ancient texts often reward patience more than speed. They invite readers into conversations rather than simplistic slogans. This is especially true when dealing with poetic language, apocalyptic imagery, prophetic warnings, and symbolic literature. Treating every metaphor as straightforward description or dismissing every warning as mere symbolism both risk oversimplifying difficult material. Responsible interpretation asks what the original audience would likely have understood before assuming what modern readers naturally imagine. That historical discipline does not eliminate disagreement, but it helps keep the discussion grounded. Perhaps the most uncomfortable realization is not that different interpretations exist. It is discovering how easily we confuse familiarity with certainty. We repeat ideas so often that they begin feeling self-evident. Eventually, we forget to ask where they originated. That happens inside every worldview, religious or secular. The healthiest response is not automatic skepticism toward everything. It is disciplined curiosity. It is the willingness to distinguish between what the text explicitly says, what later tradition concluded, what historians reconstruct, what theologians argue, and what each individual ultimately believes. Those categories overlap, but they are not identical. Keeping them distinct allows conversations to become more honest and less defensive. Maybe the deepest question is not whether someone has always been right about hell. Maybe it is whether we possess enough intellectual humility to keep learning when familiar answers become more complicated than we expected. If this conversation has reminded you that difficult questions deserve careful thinking instead of quick assumptions, consider staying for future discussions where curiosity matters more than certainty and evidence is allowed to challenge every inherited conclusion. If there is one lesson that repeatedly emerges whenever people study ancient religious texts, it is that simple answers often become complicated the moment historical context enters the conversation. That does not weaken the importance of the text. If anything, it reminds us that every document was written for real people living in real places with assumptions very different from our own. Modern readers naturally bring 21st century expectations into passages that were first heard by audiences living thousands of years ago. Those audiences already understood cultural references that now require pages of explanation. They recognized geographical locations, political tensions, familiar metaphors, and common figures of speech that modern readers frequently interpret literally, without realizing they may have functioned symbolically or rhetorically. This is one reason biblical scholarship places so much emphasis on historical context. It is not an attempt to explain away difficult passages. It is an attempt to understand them before deciding what they mean. Consider how language works in everyday life. Someone might say they are buried under work, or that a sports team was destroyed by its rival. No listener imagines those statements as literal descriptions. Context tells us how the language functions. Ancient literature works the same way, except the cultural distance makes that context harder to recognize. The Bible contains poetry, wisdom literature, legal material, prophecy, biography, personal letters, and apocalyptic visions. Each genre communicates differently. Reading them all with exactly the same expectations risks flattening the richness of the text. Discussions about hell frequently intersect with apocalyptic language, where vivid imagery often serves theological and moral purposes. Scholars from different traditions debate where symbolism ends and literal description begins. That debate has existed for centuries among committed believers, as well as historians and biblical specialists. One of the most significant conversations concerns the nature of divine judgment itself. Some Christian traditions understand the biblical evidence as teaching eternal conscious punishment. Others argue that the ultimate fate of the wicked is complete destruction, often called conditional immortality or annihilationism. A third stream, represented by some theologians throughout history, has explored the possibility of ultimate reconciliation, while acknowledging that this view remains disputed within Christianity. Each position appeals to biblical passages, historical theology, and philosophical reasoning. Recognizing that these interpretations exist is not the same as declaring them equally persuasive. It simply reflects the reality that sincere readers have reached different conclusions while engaging seriously with the same collection of texts. This raises a deeper psychological question. Why do disagreements over theology often feel more personal than disagreements over history or science? Part of the answer lies in identity. Beliefs about ultimate meaning influence how people understand justice, hope, suffering, forgiveness, and purpose. When those beliefs are questioned, it can feel as though one's entire worldview is being evaluated. That emotional response is understandable, yet it also creates conditions where defensive reasoning can replace careful listening. Intellectual humility does not require abandoning conviction. It requires recognizing that confidence should remain open to better evidence and stronger arguments. Throughout history, many respected thinkers changed their minds after years of study, not because they valued truth less, but because they valued it enough to revise earlier conclusions. The opposite danger also exists. Some people assume that because interpretations differ, certainty is impossible, and every opinion carries equal weight. That conclusion does not necessarily follow. Historical inquiry weighs evidence. Linguistic analysis compares manuscripts and vocabulary. Literary criticism examines genre and structure. Theology considers how individual passages relate to broader biblical themes. Productive disagreement depends on standards of reasoning rather than personal preference alone. The goal is not endless uncertainty. The goal is proportioning confidence to the strength of the available evidence. This approach also changes how we think about inherited beliefs. Tradition can preserve remarkable wisdom across generations. At the same time, every tradition develops through interpretation. Recognizing that development is not an accusation against tradition. It is simply a historical observation. The question, therefore, becomes not whether tradition exists, but how it relates to the biblical text itself. Responsible readers continually compare inherited interpretations with careful study, allowing both history and the text to inform their conclusions. This process is rarely comfortable. It demands patience, curiosity, and the willingness to live with unanswered questions longer than we would prefer. Modern culture often rewards immediate certainty. Ancient texts rarely do. They invite reflection rather than haste. They reward readers who slow down enough to notice nuance. Perhaps that is why conversations about hell continue after centuries of scholarship. They touch profound questions about justice, mercy, accountability, hope, and the character of God. Those questions deserve more than slogans from either side. They deserve careful reading, honest dialogue, and the humility to distinguish between what we know, what we infer, and what ultimately remains a matter of faith. If there is one habit worth developing from this discussion, it is the discipline of asking where an idea comes from before assuming it has always been obvious. Sometimes the answer will reinforce long-held convictions. Sometimes it will deepen them. Sometimes it will complicate them. In every case, thoughtful examination is more valuable than unquestioned repetition, because truth is not strengthened by avoiding difficult questions, but by engaging them honestly and carefully. There is a quiet assumption that often goes unnoticed in conversations about religion. People imagine there are only two possibilities. Either every traditional interpretation has been correct in every detail, or the entire belief system collapses. History rarely works that way. Nearly every major intellectual tradition, whether religious, scientific, philosophical, or political, has experienced centuries of refinement as new questions emerged and older assumptions were examined more carefully. That process is not necessarily evidence of failure. In many cases, it reflects a serious commitment to understanding rather than simply repeating. The discussion surrounding hell illustrates this reality remarkably well. Long before modern debates on social media, theologians, historians, linguists, and philosophers were already asking difficult questions about judgment, justice, mercy, human freedom, and the language of Scripture. Some focused on passages describing unquenchable fire and everlasting punishment. Others emphasized texts that speak of destruction, death, or the complete defeat of evil. Still others drew attention to passages highlighting God's desire for reconciliation and restoration. Each group attempted to read individual verses within the broader narrative of the Bible instead of treating isolated passages as though they existed independently. That larger narrative begins with creation, moves through humanity's repeated failures, describes covenant, exile, hope, redemption, and ends with the promise that evil itself will not have the final word. Regardless of which interpretation one ultimately finds most convincing, nearly all Christian traditions agree on one central point. The biblical story treats human choices as meaningful and moral accountability as real. Where disagreement begins is in explaining the nature, duration, and purpose of final judgment. Some argue that eternal conscious punishment best reflects the biblical witness and the seriousness of rejecting God. Others contend that final destruction better expresses both divine justice and the recurring biblical contrast between life and death. Those who advocate universal reconciliation generally argue that divine judgment is ultimately restorative, while acknowledging that this interpretation remains contested and is not the majority position within historic Christianity. These are genuine theological debates rather than recent inventions, and understanding that history helps replace caricatures with more informed conversation. The psychological lesson extends beyond theology. Human beings naturally prefer certainty because certainty reduces anxiety. Ambiguity requires patience, and patience is uncomfortable. Yet many of life's most important questions resist simple answers. Love, justice, forgiveness, consciousness, morality, and meaning continue to be explored because they touch realities deeper than quick conclusions. Religion belongs in that category. It asks questions that cannot be settled merely by confidence or repetition. It requires history, language, philosophy, personal reflection, and, for believers, faith. Recognizing that complexity should not discourage sincere inquiry. Instead, it should encourage a posture of careful listening. It is possible to hold strong convictions while still understanding why thoughtful people reach different conclusions. It is possible to disagree without assuming dishonesty. It is possible to examine inherited beliefs without treating tradition as either infallible or worthless. These habits strengthen conversations instead of reducing them to arguments won by the loudest voice. Perhaps the most valuable outcome of studying difficult subjects is not arriving at perfect certainty, but becoming the kind of person who values truth more than comfort. That means resisting the temptation to accept an idea simply because it is familiar, but also resisting the temptation to reject an idea simply because it is ancient. Both reactions can become shortcuts that prevent genuine understanding. Instead, the better path is slower. Read carefully, compare interpretations fairly, learn the historical context, distinguish between what the biblical text says, how different traditions interpret it, what historians can establish, and what remains within the realm of theological conviction. Those distinctions do not weaken meaningful discussion, they make it more honest. Whether this exploration ultimately reinforces your existing beliefs or leads you to reconsider some of your assumptions, the process itself has value. Questions asked in good faith have a way of sharpening our thinking, even when they do not produce immediate agreement. They remind us that wisdom is not measured by how quickly we answer difficult questions, but by how responsibly we seek those answers. If these conversations encourage you to read more carefully, think more deeply, and engage respectfully with ideas that have shaped millions of lives across history, then they have already accomplished something worthwhile. Continue asking difficult questions, continue examining the evidence with intellectual honesty, and continue remembering that understanding usually grows where curiosity is stronger than fear.